Hello, folks. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Erin Hunt. I'm the incoming executive director at Minds Action Canada, and we're just going to give it another minute or two to let the last few people arrive, and then we'll get started. So thank you again for joining us. Just be a moment here. Just as I unmute, somebody else pops into the waiting room. We'll get started now. So again, thank you all for joining us. As I mentioned, my name is Erin Hunt. I'm the incoming executive director at Minds Action Canada, and we're absolutely thrilled to be not even really hosting today's webinar, but really just facilitating this opportunity here from some of the young people from across North America who are taking a stand against nuclear weapons. To start with, I'd like to acknowledge the fact that I am joining you today from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, in particular the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. And I think, especially when we're talking about nuclear weapons, it's really important to acknowledge the land that we are on, keeping in mind that Indigenous populations have often bared the brunt of nuclear weapons activities around the world, and not realizing whose land we are on has dramatically impacted a number of nations and individuals' lives when it comes to nuclear weapons. So Minds Action Canada is a member of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, and it's in that capacity that we've been connected to the wonderful speakers you're going to hear from today. ICAN is a global campaign whose goal is quite simple: to prohibit and then eliminate nuclear weapons. ICAN received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017 for our work in support of the negotiations and adoption and now entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This is a global and cross-generational campaign. We've seen during negotiations in 2017, the negotiating delegation from civil society ranged in ages from 18 to about 83. And today we're really pleased to welcome perhaps the younger half of that age range here, who really demonstrate that young people have picked up this issue and are starting to run with it. We have 4 speakers here today who have all seen the impact of nuclear weapons as they participated in ICAN and our partners at Peace Boat's G7 Youth Summit, which was held in April in Hiroshima in advance of the G7 leaders meeting, which was held in mid-May in Hiroshima. So this was the first time for a number of our speakers they've been able to see a community directly affected by nuclear weapons. And for the G7 world leaders, it was also the first time for many of them. So they're going to be sharing their learning and how they and you can take action. So I will be your slide monkey. So hopefully our speakers will remember to tell me when to change slides. But up first, we have Rouge Ali, who is currently a second-year undergraduate student at the University of Toronto studying peace, conflict, and justice and history. She is youth co-chair of the Youth Nuclear Peace Summit and youth coordinator for Reverse the Trend Canada. She's taken part in various events and projects, including the launch of Reverse the Trend, Save Our Planet, Save Our People, where she is the coordinator. She's also a member of the Canadian Council of Young Feminists and previously held an internship as a Manitoba High School liaison in Senator Mary Lou McPhedran's office, where both projects overlap. She co-led her city's successful campaign for the ICANN Cities Appeal in 2021 and completed a summer internship with International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War Canada. Rouge attended the Hiroshima G7 Youth Summit as a Canadian delegation and will be continuing her activities on the city's appeal and youth engagement with Reversing the Trend Canada following the Youth Summit. She seeks to create positive contributions towards the advancements of nuclear disarmament and youth-led initiatives. So I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Hello, everyone. It's lovely to see everyone on this call today and to listen to us speak about our experiences at the G7 and what we've learned in this collective slideshow and presentation. I will just get into it and talking about nuclear weapons and why they're so important. You can change the slide. I think it's the one after too as well. Yes, thank you so much. So starting off just talking about nuclear weapons and how important they are, it's really important to first cover a lot of the basic facts that most people aren't aware of, as this type of education is not often provided in our schools. And in the context that they teach it to us, they always do it in a very limited capacity that only is contained with the events that happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not taking into consideration that nuclear weapons still exist today with over 12,000 still around on planet Earth, and that their effects are detrimental to human health and human life. That in the case of a nuclear weapon being used, and that they have been used before, they have had catastrophic consequences that until this day, communities are suffering from. And because of this information and because of these facts, it's really important that when we're discussing nuclear weapons, we really take into consideration how they're affecting communities. And one of the most simple ways that people are able to ingest this is to put it in a quantifiable measurement in the form of numbers, as people are able to understand just how great the impact is. So this is kind of a slide called nuclear weapons by the numbers, as this is a way for people to really understand it. Just 50 could kill 200 million people. And that number is probably small as well, considering the nuclear weapons today are so much more advanced than the ones that were initially used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the event of a nuclear weapon being used, there is no adequate response capacity in light of the nuclear explosion. And we learn more about this at the G7 summit when we heard from survivors and how in the event of the nuclear bomb being used, all infrastructure was obliterated, meaning that there was no one able to come and help immediately. And people were really left to fend for themselves. The use of a nuclear weapon doesn't leave anything lying around. There are no hospitals, there are no doctors. People have to come out from outside to help. And even in that case, there is radiation exposure and the zone is not safe at all. So it isn't just instantaneous like that and that's it, that the effects end there. They go onward, and communities are affected so much afterwards. One of the major treaties that kind of talks about nuclear weapons and limits or prohibits who can have them is the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the Non-Proliferation Treaty allows 5 countries to own nuclear weapons, but there are 9 that are known to have them, meaning that these countries are able to have nuclear weapons, but others are not. But what we're trying to do is also push for the treaty that kind of came out of that, which is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that looks to ban all nuclear weapons. And that's kind of a treaty that's really comprehensive because as we've seen with their impacts, there's no place on them on Earth that ensures peace. Next slide, please. Some of the other effects of nuclear weapons are also on health and wellness, which is the effects of radiation. They carry on afterwards for generations, leaving nervous system dysfunction, nausea, vomiting, all kinds of defects in the human body, and also creating birth defects and miscarriages for survivors if they're able to make it. Many of them lose their culture, lose their identity, as their entire family lineage is torn away. That was a really important concept that I became aware of at the G7 Youth Summit, was that there was a lot of marriage discrimination for those that survived after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombings, in that society viewed them differently as those who were not present in the bombings. So there are a lot of discrimination, and even after the effects, people are carrying on those consequences for the rest of their lives, and oftentimes their children are coming into the world with those damages and effects. And these are human impacts that are the most important when talking about nuclear weapons, because it is our communities that are getting affected by this. And it's important to understand like who those people are and why we need to take into consideration how their lives are affected, because nuclear weapons are used in communities, in cities where civilians live. And you can change the slide. Thank you. And just specifically talking about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as that is the place that a nuclear bomb was used and changed history forever. The atomic bomb that was used was made of highly enriched uranium, particularly in Hiroshima. It detonated 600 meters above the ground and it vaporized everything within a 1 kilometer radius. Most structures, as previously mentioned, were obliterated because most of them were made of wood. So fire damage was incredibly likely to happen. 80,000 people were killed instantly, and thousands more for months, years after, carried on those consequences. So this is something that until this day, we're fortunate to still have hibakusha, which is the name of survivors, around with us, and many of them strong enough and able enough to share from their stories. But the trauma that they've been through should have never happened to start with. And it is not at all humane, and it is against human rights to have something like that be used and to have it even be a threat. Next slide, please. In talking about the hibakusha and the atomic bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it's also important that we look at affected communities and global hibakusha as well. A general understanding of that can look at nuclear testing sites that have been used, such as the Marshall Islands, Kazakhstan, Algeria, the United States, and French Polynesia, which until this day, people are suffering from and are suffering things like stillbirths, birth defects, miscarriages. Over history, 2,056 nuclear tests have been carried out since 1945, and they have stopped in 2017. But until this day, many of these communities have lost their lands. And there's many around today that speak on their experiences, and there's many activists that are very much putting themselves forward to speak about the communities they come from and the homes that they have lost because of nuclear testing, such as the Marshall Islands. So some notable names that you can look into after this presentation that are really taking a lead forward is someone, for example, Benedict Kabua Madison, which is the executive director of the Marshallese Educational Initiative. And Benedict is someone who has, for a long time now, really taken the lead on these discussions and has spoken about the effects on the Marshall Islands and the effects on his home, and how nuclear weapons don't just affect communities when they're used in a detonation, but even testing sites and mining sites, which are predominantly done in indigenous lands, affect our communities till this day. And those effects haven't stopped, and that they've carried on for a long time now. Next slide, please. And just kind of a snippet to show some of the great work and some of the things that have come out of this activism that these members of these communities have done. This is a portion of the poem A Journey Home, which was created by 6 Marshallese students. And this is just one small tidbit of the portion that is much of the poem that is much longer and extensive, and honestly really gets in depth and is very emotional to read, because it shows that there is a cry for people to notice and for people to take into consideration that communities today are still affected. This poem really brings together, and this is the part that me reading the poem as someone who's not a member of these communities, but is touched by them and also works with others from those communities. This is a part of the poem that really spoke to me. And I really encourage you to look into it after this presentation as well and search up A Journey Home and read about some of the amazing work that these activists are doing outside and in their communities. And thank you so much for taking this time to learn a little bit about nuclear weapons. I will pass it on to the next speaker to tell you a little more about the G7 and everything else.
Thank you, Rouge. Up next, we'll be hearing from Megumi, and who did not give me her last name in her bio. It's Megumi Thurston. Thank you. Glad it's on your name there. Being Japanese American, Megumi has always been interested in World War II and Hiroshima. In 2017, she visited Hiroshima for the first time with her Japanese grandmother for her high school senior project. She conducted research and interviews with hibakusha and compared their stories to those of US war veterans. In 2022, she was accepted into the ICANN Academy, where she met with hibakusha and learned from scholars in nuclear disarmament. In 2023, she participated in the G7 Youth Summit and spoke in front of 30 parliamentarians at the Parliamentary Forum in Tokyo. In early July, she will depart for Costa Rica as a community economic development volunteer with the Peace Corps. So we're glad we were able to hear from her before she leaves for Costa Rica. So over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, and I'm really glad to have been invited to speak in front of you all. So, as mentioned a little earlier, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICANN, is where all of us met, and this is a great organization working towards nuclear disarmament. So their main goal is to promote the adherence to and implementation of the Treaty of the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or the TPNW. And on their website, they have a ton of great resources that make this information really accessible and easy to digest. For example, on the website, you can view what states have nuclear weapons, what states are holding nuclear weapons on their land, and what states do not have nuclear weapons. You can also check what countries and locations where they are in the process of signing and ratifying the TPNW. You can also find the ICANN partners around the world in different countries, so what organizations you can partake in as well. And also there's a copy of the G7 Youth Summit Youth Statement, which is what we all put together at the end of our time for the G7 Youth Summit. And on the next slide, it breaks down what the TPNW really means. And it's pretty comprehensive, as you can see, and it prohibits nations from developing, testing, producing, manufacturing, transferring, processing, stockpiling, using or threatening to use nuclear weapons, allowing nuclear weapons to be stationed on their territory, assisting, encouraging, or inducing anyone to engage in any of these activities. So, as I mentioned, it is really comprehensive, which is why a lot of states are shying away from signing or ratifying. And real quick, I just wanted to differentiate what those mean. So signing creates an obligation, but ratifying is that extra step, and it legally binds a state to implement the convention and or optional protocol. So as I mentioned, it is comprehensive, but that's even more reason why we need states to sign and ratify the TPNW. Now I'll be talking a little bit about the actual G7 Youth Summit. So general facts, it was 3 days long, but as anyone who was there can attest, it was jam-packed with activities, and every night we were exhausted because we started at 7, 8 o'clock in the morning and discussed these deep, serious issues all day long until 6. So a lot was done. 50 different participants from 19 different countries, offering different experience levels, different perspectives from different countries, cultures. So it was an amazing, amazing experience. And the format of this opportunity started off with tours. We had a tour of the Peace Memorial Park as well as the museum. There was a bunch of lectures, notably from humanitarian lawyers and hibakusha. If you look on the picture, the top picture on the right, the woman that I'm actually sitting next to in the red shirt in the middle, her name is Keiko Ogura, and she was a hibakusha, and she told us the heartbreaking testimony of growing up as a young girl during the atomic bomb of Hiroshima and afterwards, and the life that followed, and how different life looked for her and her family. There was also a bunch of discussions amongst the youth, the G7 youth, and a lot of workshops as well. Notably, there was a role playing workshop where we broke up into pairs, and one of us was a nuclear disarmament advocate, and the other one was the opposing party. So we wrote a list of questions that the opposing parties may have for nuclear disarmament advocates, like what about, mutually assured destruction and all these theories that are supposed to provide a more safe world. But we went through that exercise, breaking down each argument and actually explaining that a nuclear free world is definitely more safe, more healthy, and more sustainable for our future. So that was a really important workshop that we got to be part of. And also the social media campaign workshop, where we learned how youth can post on social media, get the word out in light of the G7 summit that was happening a couple weeks after the youth summit. So the main lesson from Hiroshima, if you take anything from my slides, I would honestly just highlight this picture on the left, because I think there's nothing else to say. What we cannot prepare for, what we cannot respond to, we must prevent. And that is the key. And Roj was talking about that in her slides as well. But aside from the immediate medical care, transportation, helping talk through these emotional, mental scars with survivors, who classifies as hibakusha, who doesn't, you know, you cannot even begin to understand, explain, remediate any of these issues that come after the initial dropping of a weapon so catastrophic. And it's important to note that the bombs dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the ones now, are hundreds of times more powerful. And so we've seen it firsthand of what happens, but that times, 100 is what we're looking at now. So we really must do everything we can to prevent this from occurring in the first place. And how inhumane and non-discriminatory these weapons really are. I've been in contact with Futagawa-san, which was an in utero hibakusha. These weapons don't care how old you are, what your view on war is, any of that. It just completely annihilates and flattens anything in its path. But we also learned that there's so many different approaches to work on these decade-long problems. For example, during one of our workshops, we were asked to write down a series of questions. And even the way that the 6 members in my group wrote down the question, the size we wrote down, the font, the way our papers were adjusted, either vertical or horizontal, we just had so many different ways to approach such a small thing like writing down a question. So who's to say we can't solve this issue in our lifetime, because we have such different perspectives, motivations for why we care about this topic. So I am very hopeful that we will make a huge impact on this issue. And also that we need to include everyone in this discussion: marginalized communities, young people, older people, politicians, poets. Everyone has something to bring to this issue, and we need to make sure all their voices are heard. And the next slide, I was also invited to speak at the Parliamentarian Forum. So there was parliamentarians from Japan, but also from Canada and Italy, which was amazing. And other parliamentarians also submitted video recordings of their support for us and our mission. So I wanted to highlight specifically Heather McPherson from Canada and Laura Baldrini from Italy. They were really passionate about this issue, to the point where they were almost standing up out of their seat, raising their voices, using their hands. And that is exactly what motivates us to continue doing this work, is to know that these politicians are people. And coming from the US, honestly, I've seen politicians as pretty cold-hearted and not human and not emotionally available sometimes to issues. But seeing these parliamentarians so intact with their emotions and allowing themselves to express that was very refreshing. And it just further emphasized the point that allies in government are paramount. We need them sharing the message of the hibakusha to their coworkers. We need them advocating for us. And there are, lifeline in those discussions that we might not be part of. We hope that they, continue to talk about ICANN and continue to advocate for nuclear disarmament. And throughout the day, I got to know Heather McPherson pretty well. And at the end of the night, we all had dinner together. And Heather and I were actually sharing a bowl of hot pot. So we were putting our meat in, our vegetables, and we're just all having a candid conversation about humanitarian impacts of war and violence. And I learned that she has 2 children. And during my statement at the Parliamentarian Forum, Miyuki-san and I talked about 3 points that we really wanted to highlight from the youth statement, but I also wanted to bring in some emotional aspects and considerations that we wanted them to think about when they visited Hiroshima in person. And one of my points was, imagine if that was your daughter or son or brother or sister whose lunchbox or coat button was the only thing that existed from their time on earth. And I think that did pull at her heartstrings a little bit, because she could empathize and understand what it is to be a parent and think of that horrible thing happening to um, her children. So I think it's really important for us to understand that politicians are people at the end of the day, regardless of how they might seem on TV or, the news. So always bringing that emotional aspect as well as factual backed information to try to get our points across. And so after this parliamentarian forum, I was very hopeful for the G7. And I think Kenneth will talk a little bit about the actual things that happened during that meeting. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Megumi. Yes, there is definitely, for my similar experience in Hiroshima, the jam-packed schedule is sort of a indicator of an ICANN event in Hiroshima. So hopefully you've all recovered in terms of sleep by now. Next, we have Kenneth Chu, who is a youth activist with Reverse the Trend from Memphis, Tennessee in the United States. He's a recent graduate of Williams College, majoring in political science and economics, and he has particular interest in addressing global inequality and injustice among marginalized groups. As an activist in the field of nuclear disarmament, he helped launch Reverse the Trend and has attended a number of conferences, such as the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons First Meeting of States Parties in Vienna, the 10th Review Conference of the Treaty, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in New York, and most recently the G7 Hiroshima Youth Summit in April. At the 10th Review Conference of the NPT, he served as a panelist for the side event Nuclear Disarmament in Our Sustainable Future, which was co-organized by the Hiroshima and Nagasaki prefectures. So Kenneth, over to you.
Hi, so today I'll be talking a little bit, about the outcome of the G7 summit. It's a pretty dense section, so I'll try to be brief and highlight the relevant points to our topics of nuclear disarmament today. Go to the next slide. So at the G7 summit, there were the 3 main issues covered in order of decreasing importance. First, the war in Ukraine was huge. Secondly, talked about nuclear non-proliferation, and next about economic security. So there are 5 main statements issued alongside, there was 5 main statements issued. The first being the G7 communique, which highlighted a number of issues, mostly covering like the subtopics below, the statement on Ukraine, a vision on nuclear disarmament, a statement on economic resilience and economic security, and the G7 Clean Energy Economy Action Plan. Can we head to the next slide? So the document to highlight for us is the Vision for Nuclear Weapons, hosted by Prime Minister Kishida of Japan. He noted that This document is of historic significance as it powerfully demonstrates the determination of the G7 leaders to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons or concrete agreement on future priorities and their direction. While this document didn't provide necessarily a binding agreement for the nuclear armed states or the other G7 countries, it was a monumental in the terms of the US, the UK, and also the other nuclear armed states issuing a bold statement that they are working towards a world free of nuclear weapons. That isn't a binding agreement by any means, but does mark a little bit of progress in terms of leaders being willing to talk about progress towards nuclear free world. The G7 statement also stressed that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. This was issued primarily in response to the Russian-Ukraine war right now, as much of the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation talk was about. They also noted that the decline in global arsenals since the end of the Cold War must continue and not be reversed, and support a nuclear-free world through a realistic, pragmatic, and responsible approach. In regards to statements on other nuclear armed countries, the G7 leaders condemned Russia's fiery nuclear rhetoric aimed at using nuclear weapons as threat, and also called on Russia to resume implementation of the new START treaty that they suspended in February. In February, Russia announced that they have the capacity and are considering launching a new nuclear test, and that's what the G7 statement was in response to. And furthermore, the G7 leaders were critical of China for attempting to modernize their nuclear arsenal, quote, without transparency nor meaningful dialogue. And as I mentioned earlier, there was no binding agreement conceived among the G7 armed states to reduce their arsenals. And just as a specification, the G7 bloc comprises of 3 nuclear armed states: France, Britain, and the US, with Italy and Germany hosting nuclear weapons, and also Canada and Japan listing nuclear weapons as part of their key security policy. Just to continue off that, the G7 leaders welcomed Prime Minister Kishida's Hiroshima action plan that called for a world free of nuclear weapons and listed kind of the steps through which that would be achieved. The G7 also emphasized the importance of bringing to force the CTBT, or the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and it called for the immediate commencement of long overdue negotiations, meaning calling for other countries to join the non-proliferation treaty, the NPT, and the CTBT as well. So going more of some of the criticisms and implications of the outcome of the summit, we see a continued dependence of G7 countries on nuclear deterrence, marked by the unwillingness of the G7 countries to reduce their arsenals, and the rhetoric used against China and Russia were accusatory, and in the sense of aiming at asking those countries to reduce their arsenals without giving up anything from the G7's end. So there we have a security dilemma that continues through as states are critical of each other and are not fully transparent with what the nuclear arsenals look like and what the future of that looks like. We also see continued nuclear spending by G7 armed countries. There was an ICANN statement made recently talking about the amount of money spent on nuclear weapons, which was in the billions in 2022, 2023, and the continued lack of transparency in G7 countries on nuclear development, the modernizing of nuclear weapons, and the number of weapons hosted or possessed. So overall, the outcome of the G7 summit, we see a conglomeration, and like the G7 countries are critical of China and Russia possessing and advancing their nuclear weapons, but without an agreement from the G7 countries to reduce their arsenal. So that's mostly the outcome of the G7 summit in regards to nuclear disarmament efforts. Moving forward, we would like to see more commitment and concrete action from the G7 countries to actually implement a reduction of their nuclear stockpiles, while not necessarily just criticizing other countries and taking a somewhat hypocritical stance on nuclear disarmament. Thank you.
Thanks, Kenneth. You made dense material go smoothly, so appreciate that. Up next, our last speaker is my colleague Gillian Flood from Mines Action Canada, where she's the project officer. She recently graduated from the University of Ottawa with a bilingual degree in conflict studies and human rights. In her view, humanitarian disarmament is a direct link between conflict and human rights. While in school, she became involved with Mines Action Canada through a virtual internship with our campaign partner in South Sudan. And after a successful internship, she was hired by MAC as project officer for the Stop Killer Robots campaign, where she worked on a short-term contract for 4 months. And then once that contract ended, we scooped her up full-time to be the project officer since May 2022. Gillian is passionate about involving and supporting more youth in disarmament, something that makes her be proud to be part of an organization like Mines Action Canada, who uplifts youth domestically and internationally. So over to you, Gillian.
Thank you, Erin, and hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. I know we all just learned a lot about the horrors of nuclear weapons, which can feel a little bit overwhelming. So I'm going to talk about what we need to do moving forward, specifically what the G7 needs to do, what other countries need to do, and also what you can do. Next slide, please. So in a nutshell, what the G7 needs to do is stop making empty promises. The G7 have publicly declared in individual statements as well as joint statements that they are committed to nuclear disarmament. However, they continue to make no steps towards disarmament and instead point fingers at other countries, as Kenneth was saying. In the statement that they made in Hiroshima, they only condemned other countries such as Russia, China, and North Korea, and how it is so important for nuclear disarmament, but they did not take any of the responsibility for themselves. Despite the fact that 3 out of the 7 of the G7 have nuclear weapons, the US, UK, and France, and another 2 host nuclear weapons on their territory, Italy and Germany. When there are 9 nuclear weapon states in total, the fact that 3 come from the G7 shows that they have a huge role in nuclear weapons, and they need to recognize that and take responsibility and start actually taking action on their commitment towards a nuclear-free world. So a way that they can take action is by stop spending so much. Right now, they're only continuing to spend extreme amounts of money on nuclear weapons while still saying that they're committed to nuclear disarmament and condemning any other country for having them. A new report just came out from ICANN, and it found that the US spent $40 billion on nuclear weapons last year alone. That's $80,000 per minute. And that is also more than every other nuclear armed country combined. So you cannot spend that much money on nuclear weapons and be committed to a world free of nuclear weapons at the same time. So as a great step, the US, the UK, and France should really begin to divert their nuclear weapons funds into other places such as education or healthcare. The next biggest spender on nuclear weapons was China at 11 billion. So even if the US spent half the amount that they spent last year, that would still leave them with 20 billion on nuclear weapons compared to China's 11 billion. So if the G7 wants to show their commitment towards nuclear disarmament, they could really start by spending less money on them. Not all the G7 possess nuclear weapons. The UK, France, and the United States have nuclear weapons, while Germany and Italy both host them on their territory. So the G7 countries that don't have nuclear weapons need to pressure their partners and show that they do not support these weapons. They should not be complicit. Canada doesn't have any nuclear weapons, nor do we host any, but by supporting our partners, we are complicit. So Canada needs to show that it has agency and a commitment to disarmament, and it has the ability to do so. We do have disagreements, I guess, on other disarmament treaties with the US, such as the Landmine Treaty, but we're still able to have a good relationship with them. So we should continue showing our commitment to disarmament and stop being complicit. And finally, the biggest thing that the G7 can do to start taking action is recognizing the TPNW as a legitimate pathway to nuclear disarmament. The TPNW is the only treaty that comprehensively bans nuclear weapons, but the G7 didn't even mention this treaty in their statement at Hiroshima. For decades, they have been saying that they're supportive of nuclear disarmament, and now the opportunity to show that support is here, and they're not taking it. So they could begin by supporting the positive obligations of the TPNW. So positive obligations mean actions such as providing victim assistance to individuals or communities who have been harmed by the use or testing of nuclear weapons, or providing environmental remediation. Last year, the treaty had their first meeting of states parties, and even if you aren't signed on to the treaty, you can still attend as an observer. Attending as an observer is important because it gives the states the ability to learn more about the treaty and how they can implement it, while also showing that they're serious about their support for nuclear disarmament. So something that we need from the G7 right now is for them to commit to attending the second meeting of states parties, which is happening this November. Next slide, please. So countries who are not part of the G7 largely need to do the same thing. If they have nuclear weapons, they also need to spend less and recognize the TPNW and join it. In the meantime, they should also support the positive obligations of the TPNW. And they also need to continue focusing the discussion on the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons and security for all. If they are a non-nuclear weapon state, they should join the TPNW immediately and condemn all nuclear weapon states. Countries should recognize the blame that all nuclear weapon states have in the nuclear threat, and not just states that they politically don't want to have nuclear weapons. Next slide, please. So now that we know about all the work that states have to do, I want to tell you a bit about what you guys can do. So the easiest thing you can do is just talk about it. Most Canadians already agree that Canada should sign the TPNW, and there is support amongst the US public as well. In 2021, there was a poll done in Canada, which surveyed 13,000 Canadians, and it found that over 70% are supportive of Canada joining the TPNW, even if we come under pressure from the United States not to do so. A poll done in the US in 2021 found that there is baseline support for the TPNW among 65% of the public. Also, ICANN has an international movement called the ICANN Cities Appeal, which gets cities to officially speak out in support of signing the TPNW. Almost every major city across Canada has signed the appeal, including Ottawa and Toronto, and dozens of cities across the US, including Washington, DC and New York City, have signed it as well. So clearly it's what the people want, and we need to make sure that the government can hear this. So having conversations also helps other people learn more about the harms and fallacies of nuclear weapons. It sounds simple, but it really works. The more people talking about it, thinking about it, the better. So if you can commit to just sharing with one or two other people what you've learned here today, and they go on to share, and they go on to share, it really will make a big impact. If you want to do a little more, you can always write to your member of parliament. Their job is to listen to their constituents. So if you write to them and tell them that you care about this issue and that you want Canada to join the TPNW, or you want the US to spend less on nuclear weapons, they do have to listen to you. There's also a petition in Canada right now put forward by MP Lindsay Matheson, which calls on Canada to sign and ratify the TPNW, as well as send an official delegation to the second meeting of states parties to the TPNW. Finally, if you want to be super engaged, you can get your city to sign the ICANN Cities Appeal. You'll need to reach out to your city council representatives and urge them to sign it. You can tell your city that almost every major city across Canada has signed it, and dozens of cities across the US have signed it as well, which I mentioned. This will take sustained commitment from you, but I promise the outcome will be so worth it because you'll be able to join a big list of cities from around the world who are committed to the TPNW. If you're interested in doing this and want any advice or support, you can always reach out to us at Minds Action Canada, and we'll be happy to help you. But really anything you can do helps, including coming here today. So thank you so much.
And thank you, Jillian. And I note there's some links and conversation happening in the chat. So please make sure you check that out. We have about 10 minutes left for questions. So I'm going to stop sharing the PowerPoint and open it up to any questions that anyone might have. I see some applause in the room, but if you have a question, please use the raise hand function. Otherwise, our poor speakers get questions from me. And I don't know if they want that. Okay, well, questions from me then, to start with, and hope that somebody from the audience will save you soon. So I guess one of the things that I've been listening to you all here talk about was really the importance of talking to people and sharing information. So I think what would be really interesting, I'd be really interested to hear, is what key piece of information or takeaway in general did you bring home from the Youth Summit in Hiroshima? And why do you think that would be, why do you think that sort of stuck with you so much?
I can go first. So my biggest takeaway from the summit, and I think probably my other speakers would agree, was meeting with the Hibakusha, Ms. Kaiko Agura. She gave a really emotional testimony, and one of the things specifically that she said was that her emotional scars are getting worse as she's getting older, because as she's nearing the end of her life and nuclear weapons are still on the planet, she's feeling guilty. And so she asked us to continue her legacy. So I think something that I like to share with others when I'm talking about nuclear weapons is I always tell people to just Google Hibakusha stories and just read their testimonies, because I think that's really the best way to understand the devastating harm that nuclear weapons can cause.
To go off of that, definitely the emotional scars, like we cannot even begin to understand. And that's why when the Hibakusha are still alive, we really need to understand their stories so that we can pass them on to our kids, for example. And this past year, I've been to Hiroshima like 4 times, and each time I take something different. But when we went with the G7 Youth Summit, the image that stood out to me the most was a group of children in the orphanage who were closing their eyes praying, and they were 5 years old, maybe 4 years old, 3 years old. And something about that image just made me start crying a lot. And I cry every single time I go for different reasons, but it's like those children are so innocent, and their parents who were put on this earth to protect them, to teach them, were just annihilated in front of them, and just they don't have like anywhere to go right now, so they're praying for peace, and that's all that they could do in that moment because they're so young. And that really emphasizes the point that while we're educated and we know these issues exist and we know the solution to them, we just need to fully advocate against nuclear weapons till literally the day we die, because once you're that age and you're so young, you don't know what to do, you don't have any explanation for it. So for preventing future orphans from losing their families, losing their parents, and experiencing that devastation and trauma firsthand, we need to do everything to avoid that.
Any comments, Roj and Kenneth? Otherwise, we do have a question here from Shane. Thanks so much for coming, Shane. Nice to hear from you. You should be good to ask your.
Hi, can you hear me now? Good. I'm curious if there's time. What is the, in quick terms, academic background of each of you? Because I'm trying to understand who has more quickly an insight. Like I started in physics in university, but quickly was shocked at how little my professors knew about the issue of nuclear weapons. So that's where I drifted into sociology and poli-sci. So I guess there are many routes to understanding, But I'm wondering, really, I guess is what led each of you? What was it that was brought you into seeing what's going on and an interest in seeing that?
Yeah, I guess I can go first. I'm Kenneth. I studied at Williams College and majored in economics and political science. A lot of my background is from the political science side. At Williams, I studied a lot of like anti-colonial movements, that kind of like the consequences of the colonial legacy. And that's something that really manifested in looking at the consequences of nuclear testing in marginalized communities. These are stories that we hear about the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but really in history and in learning, we hear nothing about the harms of nuclear testing. That's kind of the erased history, and even most nuclear non-proliferation efforts do focus on Hibakusha and the bombings, but we also have to consider the Hibakusha who are affected by testing, not necessarily the immediate impact of the bombings. So I guess like really speaking up and recognizing the voices, the marginalized voices of communities that we don't usually hear, that's something that's really drawn me to the field of disarmament.
I could go next as well, kind of building off of what Kenneth said. For me personally, I was introduced to this when I was in the 9th grade. I attended a summit called the Youth Nuclear Peace Summit. That was my first introduction to it. I think I heard about Hiroshima and Nagasaki when I was in the 8th grade and nothing else after that. But at the summit, I was terrified that this was an ongoing issue. And afterwards, I really just, I don't know, it just like sparked something in me. And since then, I just found myself trying my best to like attend as many conferences and meetings and summits and whatever I can to just learn, be in the room with people who know about the stuff, professionals. And soon enough, I found myself really fortunate to actually be in those spaces speaking as well and actually sharing my own opinions. And now I'm in my 2nd year of university and I'll be studying peace, conflict, and justice and history as well, and both of which I'm very keen on kind of looking into nuclear weapons and history in that aspect. So I'm hoping my studies also connect to this, as I've been really fortunate to spend my time in high school learning about this and really committing myself to this movement. And now I'm wanting to do that afterwards as well in university.
I can go next. So I studied conflict studies and human rights. The first time that I really heard or thought about nuclear weapons was in grade 10, when I learned that it was necessary to stop the war, which I never really agreed with, and it never sat right with me. And I don't know if that played into my degree, but I feel like I didn't learn too much about nuclear weapons in my degree, but I got involved with Mines Action Canada through an internship. And of course, Mines Action Canada is part of the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. So that's how I've gotten really involved in this campaign.
Yeah, and I can go next, but yeah, being Japanese American, like I mentioned a little bit in my presentation, I've always been interested in this issue and how 2 of the countries that I call home could just be in such a bad situation where one of them would drop 2 nuclear weapons, one after another, on Japan. So that's always been in my mind, and I wanted to understand that. So in 2017, for my senior project, I went to Japan with my grandma, my Japanese grandmother, and I interviewed Hibakusha. And ever since then, I was really interested in hearing firsthand accounts and sharing those with people. And then yeah, from there, I applied to the ICANN programs that I participated in this past year. But for me, it was being Japanese American that kind of introduced me to this subject. And I noticed in my high school years when we were taking, world history, that they did just glaze over what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And like Jillian mentioned, it was necessary to end the war. But then when you see the numbers, it's like, how can you say that instantly killing 100,000 people was necessary? So that got me thinking about this, and yeah, I've been involved since.
Thanks, everyone. And mindful of the time, I think we can get one more question. So hi, Avinash. Nice to see you. Thanks for putting your hand up. What's your question?
Hi, Aaron, and yeah, thanks so much for having this forum. Certainly learned a lot from fellow activists. It's a little bit of a long question, so and I'll just ask you answer in whatever time best suits the event. But I just came across this research paper for the International Security Program at Chatham House. This was written by Stephen Hill, and until recently, he was the legal advisor for NATO's Secretary General. And so I just quote him in saying, quote, NATO allies would welcome a concerted effort by civil society to pressure Russia, China, and North Korea. For example, to help ameliorate the international security environment. Instead, there's frustration that TPNW advocacy groups seem to focus mostly on Western democracies. So just very quickly, what are your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Avinash. Who wants to take that question?
Could you just repeat the question one more time? Thank you.
Well, more generally, it's, I think, a question that we come across as activists when people would say, well, what about North Korea or what about Russia and China? So what aboutism, basically? How would you respond to that?
I guess I can take a stab at it. So one of the things I've noticed as a nuclear disarmament advocate is that some of the non-proliferation or disarmament efforts are not genuine in the sense that words are being said to kind of perpetuate the status quo and kind of the current like security dynamics. So that's like one branch of what we see as the non-proliferation and disarmament movement. And I think that's what's being criticized as the whataboutism, that the disarmament movements are only benefiting Western democracies or Western countries. And then I think there's a genuine side when you think of more of a people who advocate for Hibakusha and like from a humanitarian perspective, that's a more inclusive and like more of a humanist approach to disarmament. And I think that second more broad approach is something that addresses kind of the whataboutism that you're talking about, and that the efforts are kind of veiled behind like a geopolitical agenda. I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that or maybe branch off something.
I could add a little bit onto that. I have heard that question before myself, and I often respond to it as historically, like efforts have been successful and like things have been able to be improved. I mean, our nuclear arsenal globally was triple what it is now, even more. So historically, efforts in civil society have been able to bring it, lower, and especially government's cooperation. I mean, like in the 80s, it wasn't just small communities of activists pushing this forward. It was marches. It was, people protesting. It was huge numbers. And I truly believe that like if it's happened before and historically it was able to, have this change occur, I'm certain that even that conversation could be prodded and pushed, because a lot of these countries that kind of point the fingers and say what if are fearful. Like it is coming from a place of fear and relying on nuclear deterrence and thinking that in having nuclear weapons, they are able to ensure peace and stability, when it's not at all the case, because accidents happen. And even just becoming more aware of history and that numerous times they have almost been used, and it's honestly just been luck, dumb luck that they haven't been used. It's knowing that it isn't security and stability that's keeping us safe. It isn't some grand plan that's been well thought out. It's really just luck all these times that's prevented accidents from occurring, that's prevented people from using them in moments of rash thinking. And historically, efforts have been successful. So I would say like it's happened before in the past, and we need to kind of deconstruct the idea of nuclear deterrence, because a lot of people still rely on it. And that's kind of the key that a lot of people tend to use in defending why nuclear weapons should still be around and why certain countries should be allowed to have them and why others can't.
Thanks, everyone. Any other responses to that? Or I can just add from a Mines Action Canada perspective, we do talk to Russia, China, and North Korea. I've met with delegates from all three countries on various disarmament issues. The problem is domestic pressure gets there, the domestic advocates get arrested. we do our best, but we don't want to be getting any colleagues or in those countries arrested or in trouble. All right, thank you all for letting us go a couple minutes over time. I think this has been a really fascinating discussion, and I really appreciate everyone joining us today. And as I did mention in the chat, this has been recorded, so we'll get it up on the Mines Action Canada website for you. And please feel free to visit our website, ICANN's website. I think Reverse the Trend has a website. And yes, Kenneth has put his email in the chat if you want to reach out directly. Otherwise, thank you all again so much for joining us, and thank you to our speakers for a wonderful, it's a lunchtime present or mid-morning presentation for me, but I think lunchtime presentation for a lot of you here. So thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you all in the halls of diplomacy, changing the world. Thanks. Have a good day.